Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us right now is Craig Shirley. He's the president and CEO of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs, one of the most respected outfits in Washington. He's also the best-selling author of Reagan's Revolution, the untold story of a campaign that started it all. Craig, it's nice to have you with us.
Thank you, John.
All right, so we're going to take a look at this new movie, The Butler, which stars Forest Whitaker as Cecil Gaines, who served 8 presidents in the White House. One of those presidents was Ronald Reagan, played by Alan Rickman. The movie's portrayal of Reagan is not the most flattering, especially on issues like race and apartheid in South Africa. Craig, do you think that these issues were grossly over-exaggerated by liberal Hollywood in order to make Reagan look bad, or is it possible that's just how the Butler remembered him?
Well, that's a good question. Is it how the Butler remembers it? It's certainly not an accurate representation of history, at least not the nuances of Reagan's policy when it came to South Africa. Everybody has to remember everything in the Reagan presidency had to be viewed in the shadow of the Cold War. This was the great struggle of our lifetime of East versus West, and it played itself out in many ways, you know, in Korea and China and Southeast Asia and on the African continent as well. And when Reagan came to the presidency in 1981, South Africa had a white minority government, obviously wrong from the standpoint of individual rights and individual freedom. But the government was also the only country on the African continent that was strongly anti-communist. So the question was that do you just cut off relations, as many were urging to do, and maybe push South Africa out of the anti-communist coalition, or do you try a third way? What Reagan did was a third way. It was called constructive engagement, which was to push the white minority government toward the inevitable, because it was a black majority country, while also maintaining its part in the coalition against the communism. And if you ask the leaders of the Zulu tribe there in South Africa, who represented millions of South Africans, blacks, they supported Reagan's policies. They were strongly anti-communist, but also wanted black majority rule. What doesn't get recorded enough, John, is that the policy was successful. It did make a transition. As we know, Nelson Mandela became president. And it was successful because it did so with a minimal loss of life, as in the case of other African countries that went from white minority rule to black majority rule, like for instance in Rhodesia, where there was widespread bloodshed.
And South Africa also became an example for the rest of the world in terms of reconciliation for both sides of the argument. And obviously we know the result here, and that is that the apartheid policies did come to an end. In the movie, during the movie, which is just now coming out, there's a lot of press out there about the way Reagan is portrayed. But what do you find to be the most dishonest, I guess, for lack of a better word perhaps, aspect of Reagan's portrayal in this movie?
Well, I don't think that he has yet been captured by any element of Hollywood correctly in terms of the nuance of his thinking, the depth of his thinking, the sophistication of his thinking, and his approach to governance and the presidency. There has not been yet one accurate representation of Reagan. I think that Spielberg did a good job, obviously, with Lincoln. Other presidents have been successfully captured in the movies, George Washington over the years, and Franklin Roosevelt, Sunrise at Campobello, that famous movie and play about the Roosevelt presidency, and Eisenhower, John Kennedy. They've all been depicted more or less accurately, but of course Hollywood is about producing a movie in 90, 100, 120 minutes, so it's hard to engage in nuance when you are trying to portray a man's life or his presidency or his career. The problem is that too much of Hollywood is dominated by people who view the world through a liberal prism, and therefore they're not looking at Reagan in the proper context of American history.
Now, another thing that kind of ruffled the feathers of a lot of conservatives and Reaganites out there is Nancy Reagan being played by Jane Fonda. And while, you know, if you've seen the movie or you've seen the previews, it's safe to say that, you know, the director and even Fonda herself did a pretty good job of remaking Nancy Reagan from an aesthetic standpoint. But of course, as we talked about, a lot of the conservatives were outraged that the woman formerly known as Hanoi Jane would play a former first lady from a Republican administration. Should anyone be bothered by this, or do you think Jane Fonda may have been a good fit for this role?
Well, this is a good question. I think that she was definitely cast to push buttons. There was no doubt about it. They chose her specifically to get people talking about it, you know, happily, or in the case of a lot of conservatives, unhappily. Ronald Reagan had his own opinion of Jane Fonda. He wrote a letter to Bill Buckley in 1981. And he said that Jane Fonda was a traitor to her country for her behavior in North Vietnam in the early 1970s during the height of the Vietnam War. So he had his own strong opinions, and of course, she had her strong opinions about Reagan herself. And the day he was elected in 1980, she was quoted in a news article saying he was a lousy actor and he'll be a lousy president. So there was obviously no love lost between the political views as far as they go between Jane Fonda and Ronald Reagan. The question is, does Fonda accurately capture Nancy Reagan? And I think, you know, the jury's going to be out on that. We're going to have to see what the reaction is once the movie hits the theaters later today.
Yeah, we'll see on that. You know, I don't believe in this movie it's portrayed where Reagan extended the Voting Rights Act. But I wanted to ask you, I know you've talked about this in the past, what do you think that Reagan would say about this summer Supreme Court decision a couple months ago about the Voting Rights Act?
I don't know what he would say about that. Of course, he did sign it, the extension of it in his presidency. He also signed the bill creating the Martin Luther King holiday. He also signed the extension of the Civil Rights Act. Is that this is again where Hollywood John doesn't get Reagan, because he was a true conservative in that he was an individualist. He thought everybody should be judged on their own merits and their own personality, and not part of a group or a clique, or part of based on their grievances, not based on their past but on their future, which made him uniquely conservative but uniquely nuanced. His life was replete with rejections of bigotry and racism. When he was in Hollywood, he had joined a country club, and then after he joined, he found out they had a policy of not allowing Jewish members. Reagan immediately resigned from that. When he was campaigning for president in 1980, Hosea Williams, who was Martin Luther King's top deputy in the Southeast, in the Christian Leadership Conference, endorsed Ronald Reagan's candidacy, as did Charles Evers, who was the brother of Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights leader who was killed in I believe it was 1964. He had a lot of support. Ed Brooke, who was then the African American senator from Massachusetts, who was a Republican but a moderate and could have taken shots at Reagan, but he was very enthusiastic supporter of Reagan's candidacy. So none of these things, as I understand it, have been reported in the movie, and so you're getting a very unfair, one-dimensional look at the essence of Ronald Reagan.
You know, while we have you here, and we're kind of expanding out from this topic of the Butler and Ronald Reagan, this week we saw some important meetings going on in Massachusetts, the meeting of the Republican National Committee. And we heard from former House Speaker Newt Gingrich talking about the need for the GOP to be, present an optimistic vision of the future and a concrete conservative alternative to things like Obamacare. Reagan, of course, knew this. He was a master of, presenting this optimistic view of the future, his famous City on the Hill speech. And what do you think about Newt's comments?
Well, just in the interest of, John, of full disclosure, I'm just now finishing a political biography of Newt Gingrich, but I happen to agree with him in this case, is that the Republican Party was essentially in the wilderness after 1932 with the rise of the New Deal until 1980. One with Eisenhower, obviously, but he was a popular war hero. Nixon in 1968, but that's because the Democrats divided their votes between Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. But And they were, in that time that they were in the wilderness, they were following the advice of Senator Robert Taft, who was the Republican leader for many years from Ohio, who said that the role of the opposition party is to oppose. But he also suggested or made it clear that it wasn't the job of the opposition party to offer alternatives to what the majority party was offering. And so the consequence of that is that you have basically a one-sided argument. We're for something, no, we're against it. Well, people will always go for what seems to be plausible versus what is emptiness. Reagan came along in the late 70s and changes all this. So by the time he's running in 1980, he's campaigning on a platform of what he called a coalition, a community of shared values, in which he makes open appeals to Democrats and independents who share his values on the family and the economy and anti-communism. But he's making positive suggestions that are all within a framework of federalism, individual rights and individual privacy and freedom. And creates an alternative to what Jimmy Carter had been proposing in 1976 and what he was trying to carry forward through to the 1980 campaign. And obviously it worked, because Reagan wins in a landslide, and he wins in another landslide in 1984 because a lot of the policies that he had proposed had come to fruition, and but he was continually proposing new policies. Then you jump ahead to 1994, is that the Republicans weren't just opposing Bill Clinton, but they were offering the contract with America, and it was a 10-point plan of what they were going to do in terms of the economy, government, corruption. So they had a competing message to go with Bill Clinton's message. And then again in 2010 is that with the rise of the Tea Party, it was really a Tea Party election, although the Washington elites didn't like it because it was a threat to the status quo, but the Tea Party had a compelling message again of taking power away from the Washington and the establishment and the elites, and giving it back to the American people where the founders intended it, starting in 1776. So I think Gingrich is absolutely right, is that if the Republican Party is to survive and move forward and thrive, it better start offering substantive, substantial proposals to the American people, and proposals that unify, not just talk to the base as the party is often want to do, but to reach out to Democrats and independents who happen to also share those values or ideas.
And that's kind of the quandary that the party is in right now, finding a way not only to unify the entire country, but also to unify their own party. We've heard this debate between Chris Christie and Rand Paul. Chris Christie talked about the importance of winning the presidential race in 2016 over ideological purity at that same meeting of the RNC. We're going to play an audio clip that CBS News obtained from Christie right here. And Craig, I'll just read it for you. We'll edit it in, but I don't know if you've heard it yet, but I'm quoting Chris Christie here. I think we have some folks who believe that our job is to be college professors. For our ideas to matter, we have to win, because if we don't win, we don't govern. And if we don't govern, all we do is shout into the wind. What do you think about Christie's comments? Is he right?
Well, it's not a chicken or egg. I agree with half of what he said. It's not a chicken or egg argument. It is what comes first, winning or issues. I would say that most conservatives, and Ronald Reagan would say, the issues come first, and then you advance those ideas, those issues, turn them into a winning message, and then you win, and then you have a reason for winning. Politics is not a sporting event. It's not a football game. The object is not just to win. The object is to achieve things. And too many Republican establishmentarians simply view power as something to either have for themselves or to deny to Democrats, but not to do anything great with it. And that's why the Republican Party from 1932 and 1980 really didn't do anything except to oppose the Democrats or offer watered-down versions of what Democrats were already offering. And so you had in 1980 and 94 and 2010 competing ideas that were then converted into winning elections, and that's what the party needs to get back to.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of conservatives would agree to you. History has a funny way of repeating itself, and I think a lot of folks are hoping that that time from 1932 to 1980 doesn't repeat itself, and they see more of the 1980 to 2000 type model, 2008 model. So Craig Shirley, with the exception of a few years there in the 90s. Craig Shirley, thanks so much for being with us here at Newsmax TV.
Thank you, John, very much.
And thanks for watching Newsmax TV.